Hey everyone, you're tuning in to episode 2 of Suncrest On Demand series, We've Got Issues. And let me tell you, last week, if you didn't catch it, you can find it on our YouTube channel right now. Go watch it right after this. But last week we started off with a really tough, honestly, really serious issue that we all deal with. So this week, for anyone who's in the Chicagoland area, here's the real issue. Where do you go for deep dish pizza? Do you go to Giordano's or do you go to Lou's? Let me know your answer in the live chat or comments, as I'm going to turn it over to my friend Jen for episode 2 of We've Got Issues.
Hey everyone, I'm Jen, and you're watching another episode of Suncrest On Demand. Before we go any further, I'm sure someone is watching your first Suncrest On Demand video. I'm super excited that you're here. So help me help you. Text the word Suncrest to 94,000. When you do that, we'll send you a digital gift card directly to your phone for some coffee, simply for getting this far in the video. Now, here's a tip for everyone watching. Make sure you have the Suncrest app. When you use our app, you get insider access to things like past content, upcoming events, stuff to help you, your kids, and your students engage with their faith journey, and much more. Actually, if you're looking to take a next step in your own faith journey right now, our app is the best tool to use. You can find the Next Steps button right on the homepage. Take a look right now to sign up for baptism, join a group to find your people here at Suncrest, or join Serving Team and make a difference. In our app and on our website, you can also partner with us financially. Your generosity makes a huge difference in Northwest Indiana and beyond through starting new churches. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for using your finances to change lives. Here's how the rest of this video is going to go. We're going to experience some music. In fact, let us know a lyric you found meaningful in the live chat or the comments. We're going to experience communion. Each week, we focus on the sacrificial love of Jesus through a simple meal. So now's the time to gather some food and drink to represent Jesus' body and blood. After the song is done, I'm going to put a timer on the screen. Feel free to eat and drink when you're ready. After communion is done, we'll listen to this week's message. Once that's done, let us know something meaningful you heard in the live chat or comments. Let's get going.
Like it's caving in, so there the peace begins. Sure as the dawn calls the sun, Jesus, we hear your love call out the light in us. Life like you meant it, I can't contain it. Hope in the here and now. What a wide horizon in the rush of heaven. Life like you made it, I wanna live it wilder than all my dreams. Such a future.
Hey everybody, last week we kicked off this We Have Issues series. It's built around a survey I gave you last year when I asked what cultural and political issues you would like me to teach about. And I told you that this week I'd be tackling abortion, racism, healthcare, immigration, and greed. And you know what? Since then, I've decided to add in human trafficking, war, and pornography. Now, of course, there's nothing funny about this. These are very heavy and sensitive topics. But here's what I want you to know. I have a vision for this message so that it seems like a sermon that would be, first, full of controversy, and second, consumed by social issues, could actually be a sermon that's empty of controversy and consumed by the most fundamental and beautiful theological truth in the whole Bible. We'll see whether I accomplish that vision or not. But I'm calling this message Valuing Humanity, and I want to walk through these sensitive subjects in the same format that I did last week with three kind of big ideas. Number one, valuing humanity tripwires. These are the places where I want you to notice if it's possible that you may not be valuing humanity. So one idea is that your approach to human dignity actually aligns with your politics. You got to be careful about that. It's so easy to let politics drive everything today. And honestly, I've heard followers of Jesus defend the mistreatment of immigrants. I've heard followers of Jesus defend abortion. And I'm asking you that you hold your preferred party, your preferred politician accountable if they suggest such things, not to defend them. You know, sometimes Christians or churches get critiqued as being only pro-life in the womb and not for the rest of someone else's life. I think that's a fair critique. But even the person who's making the critique has to realize the flip side of that to say, yeah, all the way, including the womb to the tomb, we have to value humanity. The second place I think we kind of get tripped up sometimes is that your approach to human dignity might align with your experience. Now, our experiences shape us, and we got to be honest. Sometimes they actually blind us to the realities that are around us because things start to seem normal to us. Have you ever thought about this? Thomas Jefferson, he's the one who wrote the words in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And he wrote them all the while owning slaves. How does somebody do that? How do they in one area of their life have such clarity and conviction and yet not see it in another area of their life? I think our experiences actually sometimes numb us. So I want you to be careful. You see, let's be honest, the tendency if you haven't had a personal experience with some sort of injustice or exploitation or oppression is to see other stories as isolated incidents. It's sad that it's happened, but maybe it's not that big of a problem. And on the flip side, the tendency, if you've had a personal experience something, is to extrapolate the experience you've had and say, oh, this is a problem everywhere. Listen, I just got to be honest with you. I think I've done this in my own life. We ended up fostering and adopting a black son. And I'll tell you, we never had experiences before Terrell moved into our house of having a black teenager around. And since I didn't have any experiences, I was kind of oblivious to all the things that black teenagers have to deal with in a society. And then the moment Terrell did move in and we had a black teenager right with us, I became hyper aware of it. And maybe even sometimes I'm too sensitive to the things that go on. I see employers do this. Maybe someone has a bad experience with a person who fits a profile, someone of a specific race or gender, or maybe the town or city community that they're from. And then what happens is after that one bad experience, an employer can start to categorize anyone who fits that profile to say, oh, that's just who those people are. You can be very careful with these experiences. I see it with abortion. You know, when you have a daughter that's in a tough spot with a pregnancy, or maybe you're pregnant yourself with a child who you know will be born disabled, there's all kinds of experiences that we walk through that I think are challenging and difficult, but sometimes it's actually just too easy to zero in on our experience and miss the bigger picture. So, number 2, valuing humanity, how to think. I've been asking you over the course of this series to really step back and think about things. Don't just react or don't just go through the motions. And I want you to think about today how God created the world. Here's the idea. Humanity, you and me, and all other 8 billion people on the face of the earth, we were created. We have a creator. And what the scriptures say is that you and I and every other human being was uniquely created in the image of God. The Latin term that gets used for this is imago Dei. And I want to read to you this beautiful passage from Genesis chapter 1. And don't miss that this is in Genesis chapter 1, at the very beginning where God is laying out how all of humanity and all of history would go. And as you know, a lot of times I draw attention to the idea that the created world is the world just the way God wanted it to be. You know, in the beginning of the creation account, it says, and God said, let there be light. And then he actually creates all kinds of other things. You know, we got the stars, we got the moon, we got plants, we got animals, all those things. And he says, you know, let there be, let there be, let there be. But then he gets to the 6th day of creation, and so much changes uniquely on that 6th day. It doesn't say, let there be. It says, then God said, let us make mankind in our image. What's going on there? The creator of the world, who is God, and we understand him as a trinity, a father, a son, and a spirit. That's the us idea, is essentially handcrafting humanity in his own image. He says, in our own likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. And so God created mankind in his own image, the imago Dei. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And I just want us to live with this big idea for a moment. There's lots you could take away from it. You should always remember that God does get the chance as creator to place value and purpose on his creation. We're the ones who have been created. And he gave human beings a uniquely high value above the animals, above the plants, above all other creation. He gave us a responsibility and a purpose to tend for the earth and all of creation. But fundamentally, this doctrine of man is the ability to see every human being through the eyes of God. When God created human beings, there was something special. There was a dignity. There was a beauty. And I want you to know, if you struggle with who you are, that that's true of you. And I want every one of us to embrace that it's also true of every other human being on the face of this earth. Now, here's another big idea I want you to think about. The image of God is the source of human rights. Now, I don't know how you react to the term human rights. It's a very particular term that says humans have rights that are unique to humans. And the idea here is that if you're a student of history, you're very aware that some things we assume today about human rights have not been true for most all of history. This conversation about human rights and human dignity is actually a very recent conversation. And I want you to really think about this, because as humanity has progressed, we've learned things scientifically, the natural world, we've discovered so many things, and we keep progressing. But for all that science and the natural world has brought us, it actually just leaves us wanting on this subject. And I think this is actually why faith needs science and science needs faith. Let me give you a couple of ideas of why I say this so strongly. If you take only a scientific or naturalistic view of the world and you leave God as a creator, you leave faith out of this, science alone cannot get you to the place that gives humanity a dignity. Friedrich Nietzsche was part of the Enlightenment. Actually, in his Enlightenment, his most famous quote was to say that God is dead. And when he said God is dead, he didn't mean God died. He means we don't need him anymore. We've discovered how to handle everything, handle scientific discoveries, handle progress, handle ethics, all on our own. But actually, Nietzsche was no fan of human rights. And you'll start to see how this plays out if you limit your life only to scientific thinking and leave philosophy and faith on the sidelines. He says, another Christian concept, no less crazy, Nietzsche was no fan of Christians, another Christian concept, no less crazy, has passed even more deeply into the tissue of modernity. Now, modernity is the idea that everything can be reasoned out and we can solve the world's problems ourselves. This is the issue that he thinks is crazy. The concept of equality of souls before God. He says this prototype furnishes all theories of equal rights. And he's true. He's right. If you believe that we all came from God, that we all have a soul, that there's something unique and distinct about the image of God humanity bears, then all human beings deserve rights. Oliver Wendell Holmes was an academic, actually was a Supreme Court justice early in the last century. He said this, scientifically, I see no reason for attributing to man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon or a grain of sand. And he's just saying, if all we're looking at is the natural world, then this is just survival of the fittest. It's just a progression of evolution. And you can't value one part of creation above another other than its capacity, which actually creates quite a challenge in philosophical worlds today where people are trying to value science and value human rights and come up with some way to do it outside of acknowledging that God created us and gave his image to us. So what happens today is science says, oh, our value is in that capacity. You know, human beings have a capacity that other creatures don't have, the capacity to reason, to make choices, a capacity for moral thinking, a capacity for preferences. But you just have to think about this a little while and think, if our value is attached to our capacity, that's bad news for anyone who's less capable. Peter Singer, who I'm no fan of, but I respect his consistency in this. He's a professor at Princeton. He carries this reasoning out to its logical end. Peter Singer agrees that we should have abortion available to us. He agrees that he actually says that infanticide should be available to us. He's a fan of looking at elderly people and saying, well, their value is lost. They don't have capacity anymore. We should draw their lives to an end. If you're mentally disabled or physically disabled, you might want to watch out for being on his list too. And the whole idea behind this kind of thinking is that you are your capacity, that your value is extrinsic. It's only based on what you can do, what you can accomplish, what you can bring to the table. It's not intrinsic. But I'm telling you that as a follower of Jesus and someone who understands that God created the world, that thinking is entirely wrong. And the moment that you or I value someone because of their capacity instead of because they are human, we really need to look at ourselves. So where did this idea come from? I don't mean to make this an academic lecture. Some people say it was a Western idea, but Aristotle actually advocated for slavery based on race. We know it didn't come out of just the Western world. It actually came out of the way that early followers of Jesus worked this out in real life. I don't know if you know this, but the earliest followers of Jesus were racists. They were. They thought their race was unique and was the one that God loved most. And it took Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, 15 years after starting to follow Jesus to reconcile his racism and come to the place that says, no, all people are the children of God in the image of God. And actually in the Roman Empire, one of the most heinous things that would happen is if a child was about to be born that someone didn't want, they would have an abortion. If there was a child that even was born and it had a disability, or it was a child they didn't want, it was something called exposure, and they would just leave those children to die. And it was the Christians, the followers of Jesus, the people of compassion who valued every human life with dignity, who would be voices and people who would step into difficult situations. When there were plagues and people were sick, it didn't matter. We were just going to let the sick die off. Every human being has this dignity and this value because God created us. So here's the main idea to take away from this. Injustice, oppression, or exploitation of anyone is an affront to God. That could be on a systemic level, or it could be on an individual level. If you bully someone, that's injustice, oppression, exploitation. If you participate in a system that does that, all of this is an affront to God. So I listed these issues early on. I obviously haven't spent too much time talking about them individually, but just let me walk through them for a moment. Healthcare. I think healthcare in our world, in the American world, is a very difficult subject, and I do not have the answers for it. I just know this. If you're a follower of Jesus, I'd hope that you'd advocate in some way that every human being has access to basic healthcare. Immigration, I think this is another complicated one. God actually is a fan of someone who describes that the world is set up in nations and there's borders and those really matter. So, it's not as if we shouldn't have borders and everyone flows freely. And yet, especially in the scriptures, there's a high value placed on the foreigner, the immigrant, and especially if someone's a refugee. You see, most Americans don't even take time to pull these things apart and say, well, what's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee? A refugee is someone who's fleeing this oppression or injustice or exploitation. And whenever someone's in that situation, those of us who are followers of Jesus would say, that's a person with human dignity, and we treat them as such. Human trafficking, this obviously, if God created everyone and everyone has dignity, then human trafficking's off the table. But let me attach it to a different subject, pornography. I've read enough studies to know this, that if pornography went away, human trafficking would go away. That pornography is not the victimless crime that many would like to suppose that it is. And the moment that you objectify another person, not relate to them, but treat them as an object, all of a sudden you have a human being who God created with dignity, and you're stripping that dignity away. War is a difficult subject to sort out, but I would just say for the followers of Jesus, you shouldn't be quick to go to war. You shouldn't go to war for economic reasons. There's actually a just war theory that's been well sorted out over centuries to say this is how a follower of Jesus would think about going to war. And then there's these two things that I do keep coming back to. And I want to name them strongly today as, I think, the two sins of America: abortion and racism. I know that abortion is a sensitive subject. And I have a lot of compassion for people who are in difficult circumstances with pregnancies that weren't planned or that they don't want. But fundamentally, we do come back to this principle that I want to advocate for. I want to shine the light for. I want to help people see that every human being, including one who's in a womb and still fully dependent physically on his or her mother, has the dignity of a child. And there is no way that a follower of Jesus could advocate for that abortion. Racism, Is there a greater sin of our nation? I mean, the early story of our country is it was built entirely on the backs of slavery rooted in racism. And even after slavery was set off to the side, there were so many systems, structures that kept Black people, African Americans, in a marginalized, oppressed system of injustice. We made strides in the mid-1900s towards civil rights, but I hope we can all acknowledge today this continuing sin of America is not gone. And my hope is that followers of Jesus are the ones who advocate the most that every person has dignity and value before God. There's a story in the book of Exodus. It's fascinating to me. Maybe you remember this. It's when the Israelites were placed into slavery after helping the nation of Egypt thrive. One of the Egyptians said this. He said, "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them. And I think this may seem like a far-off story, but this is how it works most of the time. Someone feels threatened by a person or a group of people, and in order to overcome that personal threat, they put together something that pushes them down. Exodus 2:23 says, the Israelites groaned. And I always ask people when I read that passage, do you think it was okay for them to groan? Do you think it's okay that someone who was one being oppressed, one being exploited, is it okay for them to groan? What do you do when someone around you says, I'm being oppressed, I'm being exploited, they're groaning? Do you listen to their cries? Because the Lord listened to Israel's cry. Actually, what the Lord did was he raised up a leader, Moses. And when he first asked Moses to lead people out of this slavery, do you remember what Moses' response was? He said, please send someone else. And friends, I'm afraid that followers of Jesus in our world today are using the playbook of Moses. God, I don't like it. I know it's bad, but I kind of have my life going on over here. Please send someone else. Which leads us to number 3, valuing humanity, how to engage. And so I want to ask you that your approach to human dignity aligns not with your politics or your experiences, but with your Creator. James, brother of Jesus, wrote it this way. He said, with the tongue, we praise our Lord and Father, and with it, we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness and God's image. He says, put that together in your mind. You say you worship God, and then the creations of God that he gave his likeness to, you push them down. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. And so I want to ask you all to take a journey. It's going to require some reflection. It's going to require some humility. And it's actually going to require some action. But my hope is that the followers of Jesus, Suncrest Church here in Northwest Indiana, that we would be the strongest voice for all of humanity. So I think there's 3 roles that we play. First is confessor. Confessor. And I want to just kind of model something to you here myself. If you've been around Suncrest, you know that over the last year, I've not hesitated to speak about race and racism. But over a longer season here, I've not really spoken about abortion. I told you last week that I got some questions from people when I asked for feedback on this series. And one of those questions was a convicting question to me. Greg, why do you speak about racism, but you don't speak about abortion? And I thought, I have to be honest. I have my reasons. One of my reasons is I know on the subject of abortion, not only is it sensitive, but I'm confident there are women listening to my voice right now, maybe you, who have had an abortion. And I want you to know my posture toward you is not that you're a murderer. It's actually that you are a human being with dignity, made in the image of God. And I don't want you to carry that abortion with you for the rest of your life, or even the guilt of that abortion with you for the rest of your life. I want you to find your freedom in your confession to God. And I have to confess other things about myself that because of my experiences, I've either ratcheted things up or ratcheted them down. But let me just show you one example real quick. I have a very good friend. He's a pastor in New York City, and his name is Jordan Rice. Gotten to know Jordan quite well over the last few years, and I have so much respect for him and the new church that he started in New York. And he's been a leading voice, I think, for Black Americans, Black pastors on the subject of racism. And in some of the height of the racial tension last year, he posted this on Twitter. Just follow this with me. He says, "The white evangelical playbook." Now, let's be honest. Suncrest is a mostly white church. I don't actually love the term evangelical, but by most definitions, that's a fair description for who we are. So he's naming this about me. He says, here's what they do. They say and do nothing about racism for a long time. Then they wait for an international headline. Something's in the news. They have a conversation about race. They get celebrated because they had this bold conversation. Then they do some token demonstration, maybe even hire a Black person, wait for applause, and then just repeat as necessary. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. The first time I saw this post from Jordan, I'm like, oh, come on, Jordan, we don't do that. And then I started reading through the list, and I think, oh, yeah, we did that. Kind of quiet about it. Yeah, when there's a headline, have a conversation. Do you remember a few years ago, if you were around Suncrest, we had a conversation about race? I mean, he's nailing it right here. And then you kind of let it lapse from your front page as a church because it's lapsed from the headlines, repeat as necessary. And it just made me think, thank God for my friend Jordan. He helped me see something in myself that I couldn't see myself. And so I confess. For a while, that was my playbook, but no more. Friends, confession is good for the soul. Pride stands in the way. We get defensive about ourselves all the time, but don't get defensive. Be a person who can confess the places you have not treated humanity as in the likeness of God. The second thing is to become a defender. And by defender, I mostly mean the idea of advocate. You become a voice for the voiceless. I mean, this is part of the challenge that these structures introduce, is that while someone is being pressed down, while someone is being treated, while someone's being exploited in an unhealthy way, not only are they being pressed down, but they lose their voice. And I think this is one of the reasons why abortion is so significant for me. Someone has to be a voice for the voiceless. And the unborn child in a mother's womb doesn't have any voice in our world. So I don't know what your subject is, but I want you to think, wherever it is happening around me, and maybe it's just personal. Maybe it's in the hallway at your school, or at the water cooler at your office, somebody's being bullied. Someone is being pushed down. And it isn't you, so you don't have anything to confess. But you do have something to defend. And placing yourself in the middle, not taking the Moses approach that says, send somebody else, is what a follower of Jesus would do. You know, in the end, this is going to require sacrifice. I say you need to be a provider. You actually have to step in. You have to let it cost you something. And I think one of the things those of us who, live in, a pretty nice suburb and have a pretty nice, at least material life, is we have to kind of reconcile it with ourselves that if the reason anyone else can't have well-being is because I'm protecting my excess, I need to stop protecting my excess. And I need to be about the mission of Jesus that is restoring the broken world. Friends, I just want to close this message hoping that we actually have a concept here that isn't controversial, that God created every human being in his likeness. And so whenever you or I lock eyes with any human being or see a headline about any human being, our response is they're a human being. And there's a vision from the prophet Isaiah for how to make our way through this. He says, yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and you exploit all your workers. That's a critique. He's saying the same thing. You praise God with your mouth and then you curse people who God created in his likeness. It cannot be. Don't act like you're fasting and then exploit your workers. He says, is this not actually the kind of fasting, the kind of sacrifice that I've chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, if you do away with the pointing finger, if you do away with the malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. Suncrest, that's my prayer for you. That wherever something becomes an issue of human dignity, that you will spend yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, so that your light will rise in the darkness.
Before you turn off this video, hit the like, subscribe, and share buttons. We'll see you next week, same time, same channel. And until then, go and be the church.